Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, July 12, 2023. FBI Director Christopher Wray testifies before the House Judiciary Committee, where the Republican majority accuses him of weaponizing the FBI against conservatives. The Democratic minority on the committee saying that the hearing is nothing more than an effort to protect former President Donald Trump from the consequences of criminal acts. President Joe Biden meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the NATO summit in Lithuania, both praising new pledges today from the U.S. and other G7 leading industrialized countries to support Ukraine's military and economy long term, as Ukraine's war with Russia is now a year and a half old. And President Biden acknowledging President Zelensky's frustration that NATO has not set out a clearer path for Ukrainian membership. Back in the U.S. House starts work on the annual National Defense Authorization Bill as Freedom Caucus members push to be allowed to offer amendments on abortion, drag shows on military bases, and teaching critical race theory at service academies. We'll talk about it with Emily Brooks, House reporter with The Hill. And the State Department is asked about a report that hackers based in China gained access to email accounts at 24 organizations, including some U.S. government agencies. This reporting from the New York Times, Republicans bombarded Christopher A. Wray, the FBI director, with criticisms about his role in the Trump documents investigation, efforts to address extremist violence, and the Bureau's surveillance practices during a grim and contentious House Judiciary Committee hearing on Wednesday. Republicans on the committee, led by the chairman, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, treated Mr. Wray as if he were a hostile witness, repeatedly interrupting his attempts to answer their rapid-fire queries. Most of the Republicans sought to portray the nation's premier law enforcement agency and Mr. Wray, who was appointed by President Donald J. Trump, as political tools of the Democrats. For the most part, Democrats defended him, though some on the committee grilled him about the FBI's practice of extracting the personal information of American citizens from the Internet. That's from the New York Times. Congressman Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, asked Director Wray during the hearing about a recent order from a federal judge banning federal agencies from communicating with social media companies. This stems from a case alleging the Biden administration went too far in trying to remove what it saw as misinformation from the social media, including concerns about COVID-19 vaccines.
The court found apparently the FBI engaged in a massive effort to suppress disfavored conservative speech and blatantly ignored the First Amendment's right to free speech. The evidence shows the FBI threatened adverse consequences to social media companies that they did not comply with its censorship request. The court found that, quote, this seemingly unrelenting pressure by the FBI and the other defendants had the intended result of suppressing millions of protected free speech postings by American citizens. As a result, the court states, for example, millions of citizens did not hear about the Hunter Biden laptop story prior to the November 3rd, 2020 election. Page 4 of the court ruling lists some of the important subjects that the Biden administration and the FBI forced the social media platforms to suppress. The evidence shows your agency, the people that directly report to you, suppressed conservative-leaning free speech about topics like the laptop, the lab leak theory of COVID-19's origin, the effectiveness of masks and COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccines, speech about election integrity in the 2020 presidential election, security of voting by mail, even parody about the president himself, negative posts about the economy. The FBI made the social media platforms pull that information off the internet if it came from conservative sources. They did this under the guise that it was disinformation. Can you define what disinformation is?
What I can tell you is that our focus is not on disinformation, broadly speaking.
Well, wait a minute. Yes, it is. Wait a minute.
Can I answer the question?
You can in a minute. Your star witness said in the litigation, Elvis Chan, who's in charge of this, said they do it on the basis of disinformation. We need a definition of what that is.
Our focus is on malign foreign disinformation, that is foreign hostile actors who engage in covert efforts to abuse our social media platforms, which is something that is not seriously in dispute.
I have to stop you for time. That's not accurate. You need to read this court opinion because you're in charge of enforcing it. The court has found that, and Elvis Chan testified under oath in charge of this for you. He said 50%. He had a 50% success rate in having alleged election disinformation taken down or censored. That wasn't just foreign adversaries, sir. That was American citizens. How do you answer for that?
Well, first off, I'm not sure that's a correct characterization.
Comes right out of the opinion. You should read it.
Of his testimony. But what I would say is the FBI is not in the business of moderating content or causing any social media company to suppress or censor.
That is not what the court has found.
What I would also say is among the things that you listed off, I find ironic the reference to the lab leak theory. The idea that the FBI would somehow be involved in suppressing references to the lab leak theory is somewhat absurd when you consider the fact that the FBI was the only agency in the entire intelligence community to reach the assessment that it was more likely than not that that was the explanation
but
for the pandemic.
Your agents pulled it off the internet, sir. That's what the evidence in the court has found.
Congressman Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, questioning the FBI Director Christopher Wray at today's Judiciary Committee hearing. In another exchange, Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, asked the director about investigations of President Biden and his son Hunter on overseas business dealings when Joe Biden was vice president.
I'm sitting here with my father. I will make certain that between the man sitting next to me and every person he knows and my ability to forever hold a grudge, that you will regret not following my direction. I am sitting here waiting for the call with my father. Sounds like a shakedown, doesn't it, Director?
I'm not going to get into commenting on that.
You seem deeply uncurious about it, don't you? Almost suspiciously uncurious. Are you protecting the Bidens?
Absolutely not. The FBI does not and has no interest in protecting anyone politically.
You won't answer the question about whether or not that's a shakedown, and everybody knows why you won't answer it. Because to the millions of people who will see this, they know it is. And your inability to acknowledge that is deeply revealing about you.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, and the FBI Director Christopher Wray at the Judiciary Committee hearing today. As the hearing was going on, White House spokesperson Ian Sams issuing a statement that reads, "Extreme House Republicans have decided that the only law enforcement they like is law enforcement that suits their own partisan political agenda. Instead of backing the blue, they're attacking the blue, going after the FBI, federal prosecutors, and other law enforcement professionals with political stunts to try to get themselves attention on the far right." That statement from the White House spokesperson Ian Sams. Back to the hearing, something similar from Congressman Hank Johnson, Democrat from Georgia.
Welcome to the legislative arm of the Trump re-election campaign. A grand jury found probable cause that, among other crimes, Trump illegally kept highly sensitive national security documents, which could put our country and others and our sources in danger if they got out, and which photographs show Trump kept those records in bathrooms, showers, closets, and in the Mar-a-Lago ballroom. MAGA Republicans are afraid that the justice system might hold Trump accountable for his actions. So to protect him, Republicans are trying to intimidate FBI officials. And in case that does not work, Republicans are trying their hardest to discredit the FBI in the eyes of the American public. When Trump lost in 2020, they tried to make Americans distrust their election systems. And now that the FBI and the Justice Department have sought to hold Trump to the same standard any other American citizen would be held to, MAGA Republicans are telling Americans not to trust the FBI. To protect Trump, Republicans are trying to distract us from the real work that the FBI does every day, which is fighting violent criminals, child predators, and fighting domestic terrorists and extremists so as to protect our democracy and our national security. And even worse, MAGA Republicans are stirring up threats that pose a danger to the safety of FBI employees.
Congressman Hank Johnson, Democrat from Georgia. You can find today's full hearing, House Judiciary Committee, with testimony from the FBI Director Christopher Wray at our website, cspan.org. Runs about 5 hours. Director Wray has been in office since August 2017. FBI directors under law serve a 10-year term, but can be removed earlier by the president. This is Washington Today. From Associated Press, Dateline Vilnius, Lithuania, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed fresh pledges of weapons and ammunition to fight Russia's invasion, along with longer-term security commitments from the West on Wednesday, even as he expressed disappointment over the lack of a clear path for his country to join NATO as the alliance wrapped up its annual summit. A joint declaration issued by the G7 lays the groundwork for each nation to negotiate agreements to help Ukraine bolster its military over the long term. President Zelensky described the initiative as a bridge toward eventual NATO membership and a deterrent against Russia. That from Associated Press. Joining President Zelensky for statements on the G7 commitments, the leaders of the G7 countries, including President Joe Biden.
We just concluded the first meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, and all our allies agreed Ukraine's future lies in NATO. That's not a surprise to any of us, I don't think. I hope it's not a surprise to you, Mr. President. Allies all agreed to lift the requirements for membership action plan for Ukraine and to create a path to NATO membership while Ukraine continues to make progress on necessary reforms. But we're not waiting for that process to be finished to make the long-term commitments that we're making to Ukraine's security. Vladimir and I shouldn't be so familiar. Mr. Zelensky and I talked about the kind of guarantees we could make in the meantime when I was in Ukraine and when we met in other places. And so today, the long-term commitments we're making are backed up by the notion that in the meantime, we're going to provide security to Ukraine for its needs and against any aggression that may occur. Today, the members of the G7 are launching a joint declaration of support for Ukraine to make it clear that our support will last long into the future.
President Biden at the NATO summit in Lithuania, standing beside President Zelensky and the other leaders of the G7. G7 include Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. A story from Reuters: the Kremlin said on Wednesday that security assurances the West is planning to offer Ukraine would be a dangerous mistake that would impinge on Russia's own security and expose Europe to greater risks for years ahead. President Zelensky also met separately today with the NATO Secretary, Jens Stoltenberg, and they took reporters' questions. One to President Zelensky was the NATO statement about Ukraine's path to membership, which would only be after the war with Russia ends and when the allies agree and when unspecified conditions are met, a plan that President Zelensky yesterday had called absurd.
We clearly understand that partners are helping us with weapons, and this is a moment of survival. This is something that we need. We understand that someone is afraid of talking about our membership now, because nobody is willing to have a world war, and which is logical and understandable. I want everyone to understand that we are civilized and adequate people. Ukraine is fighting, and it truly understands that Ukraine cannot be a member nation to NATO as long as the war continues on our territory. This is absolutely clear, but those signals are important. Those signals that would have been mentioned in bilateral meetings with Secretary General, with partners, and I had a number of meetings already, those statements about Ukraine becoming a member nation of NATO. And already we can hear some confident statements when the conditions will be met. My understanding is that when it will be secure on our land, on our territory.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky through an interpreter at a joint news conference with the NATO Secretary General at the NATO summit in Lithuania. Later in the day, President Zelensky met with U.S. President Joe Biden to discuss the new G7 security guarantees for Ukraine and the plan for eventual Ukrainian membership in NATO. President Zelensky also talked about the decision by President Biden to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine. Those munitions are controversial because some of the bomblets that come out of them when the cluster breaks up may not explode and could pose a threat to civilians for years.
Well, Mr. President, welcome. And I hope you all got a sense today from all of my colleagues that how much support you have. It's real. And I hope we finally have put to bed the notion about whether or not Ukraine is welcome in NATO. It's going to happen. You're all moving in the right direction. I think it's just a matter of getting by the next few months here. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And, it's hard to believe, 500 days. It's easy for me. Just mostly, I've been in and out of Ukraine a lot before the war and some since the war. But I'm going to say again what I've said to you many times. Not only all of you, but your people, your sons, your daughters, your husbands, your wives, your friends. You're incredible. Ukraine, the whole world's seeing the courage. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. The courage and commitment of the average Ukrainian. When you see a 65-year-old woman on television after her apartment's been bombed out, picking up the pieces and going to help the next door neighbor. I mean, it's just astounding. You're setting an example for the whole world of what constitutes genuine courage. From the bottom of my heart, I mean that. What courage means. And, I think it's your resilience and your resolve has been a model for the whole world to see. And the frustration, I can only imagine. I know you're many times frustrated about when things get to you quickly enough and what's getting to you and how we're getting there. But I promise you, the United States is doing everything we can to get you what you need as rapidly as we can get it to you. And the Secretary of Defense has been a constant, how can I say it, refrain from the Defense Department and everywhere else, and calling other Secretaries of Defense around the world to say, let's get some help. So I just want you to know it's real. And here in Vilnius, we held the first, as you well know, NATO-Ukraine Council. But you and I talked about this beforehand, about the commitments, the security commitments we were going to make while it becomes official, until it becomes official. And I think that's important. And I want to tell you, when I got here, Mr. President, and I started to sell that idea to other heads of state, there was no reluctance. There was no, oh, I don't want to. It was everybody just said, okay, and sign on. So it's real. You've done an enormous job. You have a lot more to do, I know, and I just think that we're going to make sure that you get what you need. And I look forward to the day when we're having the meeting celebrating your official membership in NATO. So thank you for what you're doing, and the bad news for you is we're not going anywhere. You're stuck with us. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I will start. You said about 500 days is really a difficult job for our people, soldiers and civilians, mothers, fathers, and children, really to fight for their life, and for these values. And thank you very much that all these days you are with us. I mean, you and Americans, all of Americans and Congress. I mean, thank you, Mr. President, that you, like we say, shoulder to shoulder with us from first days of full-scale war. We appreciate for this very much, and really, we understand your leading support, because when you give such messages and when you gave sometimes some weapon, I'm sorry that, but I want to say it to journalists, like I said during our meeting, our council, that it's very simple, to criticize, for example, clusters ammunition, which you made difficult political decision, but you have to know that Russia used such weapon from the first days, not only full-scale war, from first days of occupation of Crimea, from 2014 and 15, in all our territories. In Donbass they used it, and now they continue doing. And that you gave us, this decision will help us to save us. And that's why my appreciation for this. And I didn't hear from all the, parts of the world. When Russia began to use it, I didn't hear that some of, countries criticized Russia. But I think that it was very useful to put them. So thank you so much for this help. We really counted on it, not only on this, I mean that's totally, and you gave us huge support. I want to thank to all Americans. We understand that it's more than 43 billion for today. It's big support, and I understand that it's all your money, but you have to know that you spend this money for not just for fighting. You spend this money for our lives, and I think that we save the lives for Europe and for all the world. So thank you very much for this also summit. At the end of the summit we had, I think, this council and great success and security guarantees, as you said, that we began to speak about it in Kiev. So now we see that you had great idea, that's G7, and now I know that last message that also there are countries which joined to G7 decisions, and I think it will help very much because it's really fact that it's very concrete things. So, thank you.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky meeting President Joe Biden one-on-one at the NATO summit in Lithuania. President Biden wrapped up the two-day summit with a speech at Vilnius University where he said, "We will not waver. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes." And when he finished, the crowd chanted, USA. You can find the president's speech and all of C-SPAN's coverage of the NATO summit in Lithuania at our website, cspan.org. From NBC, hackers in China recently broke into the email accounts of around 25 organizations, including multiple government agencies, Microsoft said. The State Department confirmed it was one of the victims, a spokesperson said Wednesday, and first alerted Microsoft and the U.S. government cybersecurity officials to the hacking campaign. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the federal cybersecurity watchdog, announced Wednesday that it first learned of the breach in mid-June. Microsoft did not name any of the affected countries or agencies, but said that the group primarily focuses on hacking Western governments to spy on them. Microsoft said it worked with CISA to kick the hackers out, indicating U.S. organizations were among the victims. That reporting from NBC News. Here's part of the exchange with the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller today with AP reporter Matt Lee.
So what can you tell us about this hack, this infiltration of at least State Department email accounts?
I can say that last month the State Department detected anomalous activity. We did two things immediately. One, we took immediate steps to secure our systems, and two, took immediate steps to notify Microsoft of the event. As a matter of cybersecurity policy, we do not discuss the details of our response. The incident remains under investigation, and we continuously monitor our networks and update our security procedures.
Well, can you just explain to those of us who are technologically illiterate what anomalous activity is?
That might be the blind leading the blind in this instance. I will say that an anomalous incident, I don't want to get into the details because it does remain under investigation, and but it is
like gets returned because they're on vacation.
It is activity in which an actor is attempting to or is successful in breaching our systems. We discovered it last month, and as I said, immediately took steps to secure our systems and then also notified Microsoft.
Were they successful in breaching the system?
I am not going to speak in any detail about the underlying event.
Okay, and this happened, you discovered this before or after the Secretary's trip to Beijing?
I'm not at liberty to say the exact date, other than that it was last month.
And do you have reasonable suspicion about who might be behind it?
We have not yet made a public attribution. Yeah, I know. We've certainly noted the attribution that Microsoft has made for the incident.
Do you have any reason to doubt?
No, but on behalf of the U.S. government, we have not made our own attribution at this point.
But you have no reason to doubt?
No, but
Okay.
that's not the same thing as us confirming with our own attribution, of course.
I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying you don't have any reason.
We understand each other.
I mean, you don't think it's like, I don't know, people from the Falkland Islands?
I do not believe it's people from Falkland Islands.
Okay.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, NBC News, quoting Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, chair of the Intelligence Committee, that he and other committee members are closely monitoring what appears to be a significant cybersecurity breach by Chinese intelligence. And Mark Warner is saying it's clear that the PRC, People's Republic of China, is steadily improving its cyber collection capabilities directed against the U.S. and our allies. Close coordination between the U.S. government and the private sector will be critical to countering this threat. That from NBC News. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Thursday on C-SPAN Radio at 10 a.m. Eastern, Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina Khan testifies before the House Judiciary Committee. She could be asked about the FTC's investigation of Twitter under CEO Elon Musk and reports she did not recuse herself from the FTC case against Meta Platforms despite advice from FTC ethics officials. FTC Chair Lina Khan before the House Judiciary Committee. Live Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. Listen on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or on your smart speaker. Say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A story from Newsweek about the House consideration of the Defense Authorization Bill. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, they write, is expected to come face-to-face with a dramatic fight on the House floor this week, but the beginning days of the anticipated clash are likely to provide some solace for him. The House is set to begin its annual debate on the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, which has earned bipartisan support every year for the last 6 years, but the must-pass bill has recently become embroiled in controversy. Far-right lawmakers on the House Freedom Caucus have targeted President Joe Biden's Pentagon policies on diversity, climate change, abortion, and vaccines, setting up a spar with Speaker McCarthy on whether social issues should be included in the defense policy bill. That was reporting from Newsweek. Today was part one. Congressman Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, the Rules Committee chair, opening debate on the House floor on the first of two expected rules governing debate on the defense authorization bill and those controversial amendments not included in this rule.
Mr. Speaker, the NDAA is one of the most critical pieces of legislation the House considers each year. Congress has a constitutional obligation to provide for the common defense, and this is an obligation I know the House takes very seriously. Each year, the NDAA enables the Congress to set appropriate defense policies, to provide guidance and direction to the armed forces, and above all, to set authorization levels for defense funding. Collectively, these efforts provide our warfighters with the training, equipment, and strategy necessary to meet any challenge around the globe. Congress has enacted the NDAA every year for the last 62 years. While we have a long road ahead of us, I'm confident that we will do so again this year, and I'm gratified that the House is moving forward with consideration of this measure on the floor. Last month, the House Armed Services Committee reported out H.R. 2670 with an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 58-1. From a review of the bill, it's easy to see why. H.R. 2670 authorizes $886 billion for the defense programs, an increase of $28 billion. This funding level will ensure our men and women in uniform are equipped for all threats and are prepared and ready to defend freedom all around the globe.
Congressman Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, the Rules Committee chair, starting debate on the House floor today. The ranking Democrat on the Rules Committee is James McGovern from Massachusetts.
I've been in the majority before. I understand it's not always easy. But what's happening today on the floor, not knowing when we are coming back to finish the second rule for this bill, or what offensive amendments will be included, is not just weird, it's nuts. A small group of radical hard-right members, the MAGA circus I call them, is threatening to take down the NDAA rule unless they get their way. The unless they get their way part is really becoming a theme in this Congress. I don't envy the gentleman from Oklahoma because what he is dealing with is truly bizarre. The MAGA circus wants to load up what could and should be a bipartisan bill that passes every single year. And they want to load it up with every single divisive social issue under the sun via the amendment process. Anti-abortion? Check. Anti-LGBTQ rights? Check. Anti-gun safety? Check. And it's not just that they're demanding it, it's that Republican leadership is probably caving.
Congressman James McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts, chair of the Rules Committee, today on the House floor. The House went on to pass the first rule, setting up general debate on the NDAA and the first batch of amendments. As for the second rule, which will cover more controversial subjects from the Freedom Caucus members, according to reports, a reporter asked the House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican from Louisiana, about that.
Question on the NDA. First on timing, are you guys going to finish it this week? And if you just talk to Mr. Scott Perry, the HFC, he says abortion, gender, and Ukraine amendments have got to get a vote. Will those amendments get votes?
Yeah, and we've been having conversations with Scott Perry and others on just what the final round of amendments will be. There are already some amendments that have made it through on some of those issues. There's additional conversations we're having. We did get agreement last night. I think it was about 290 amendments that we got agreement on that we put in the rule that we're going to pass today. And so once that rule passes, we'll then start actually debating those amendments and start voting on them tomorrow. And then we're going to continue the conversation on the remaining items.
House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican from Louisiana. Emily Brooks, House reporter for The Hill, has been covering the National Defense Authorization Act amendment process and joins us now by phone. Thank you very much. You report that the demands for amendments on hot-button issues from Freedom Caucus members are complicating efforts to pass the bill. What types of amendments and what are the complications?
Well, basically, a lot of hot-button issues about diversity and inclusion initiatives, abortion issues. One of the big hot-button issues is the Pentagon's policy to allow travel reimbursement costs to be approved for women to go and have to get an abortion. And that is something that has not been repealed in the current version of the NDAA, and something that some conservatives would like to see an amendment vote on at least, or the final bill having that reversal of that policy. So that's just one example. Ukraine issues are another major issue. There is a little bit of funding for Ukraine in the NDAA that some members want repealed, and also they want to do things like block more F-16s from being sent to Ukraine, a lot of hostility there. So exactly which of those amendments will get a vote or be considered is what the Rules Committee and House GOP leaders are trying to figure out right now, because the risk here is that if some of those amendments are approved, then Democrats will not vote for the bill. And it's pretty likely that Republicans will need Democratic support in order to pass it, given the history of Republicans voting against the NDAA in the past for various reasons.
When might we find out when these amendments, if they're made in order, are made in order?
Well, so far there have been some non-controversial amendments made in order. The House is currently working through about 290 amendments, but there have been meetings in Speaker McCarthy's office with members like Representative Chip Roy and Representative Ralph Norman, two hardline conservatives who both sit on the House Rules Committee, and our Freedom Caucus members have been meeting and saying that they are not expecting the NDAA to be completely wrapped up this week at all, which is sort of like an initial target that some people were expecting when we started this week. So this could stretch into next week. Whether they figure out those amendments, they might figure it out before the end of this week. They might not. But there were 1,500 amendments filed to the House Rules Committee. That's a lot of work to go through, even before you consider the political implications of the controversial amendments.
We're talking with Emily Brooks, a reporter with The Hill, and we're just talking about the first step in this process of passing the annual Defense Authorization Bill. Have Senate leaders, Democrats, and maybe some Republicans talked about these controversial amendments? Has the White House weighed in?
Well, for Democrats, a lot of these are a non-starter. The Democratic ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee said that, like, hey, if some of these amendments pass, Democrats will oppose it. And the Senate will pass their own version of the NDAA, and then the House and Senate will resolve differences. And even if the House does pass some of these controversial measures, they might not make it in the final package, particularly if the White House is going to oppose some of them. So there is a long way to go for the NDAA. That is one of the reasons why some, particularly moderate Republicans who are very defense-focused, want to get this done as soon as possible in order to give enough time to have the Senate go through their process and then resolve difference, so there's not a rush to do this later on this year, and so that they can approve some new authorization and funding levels for the Defense Department that they would like to see enacted as soon as possible.
And finally, not considering these amendments that may be added, the underlying bill, is that a bipartisan bill?
Right now, the underlying bill is a bipartisan bill. It received broad bipartisan support when it was passed out of the House Armed Services Committee last month. And so that's what is at stake right now with these more controversial amendments, particularly on Ukraine, is that if there are any of these amendments that are approved, then that could jeopardize that strong bipartisan support. Not only would that have implications for passing the bill, but just, for the implications of the long tradition of the NDAA being a strongly bipartisan bill that both parties can work together on.
Emily Brooks is a House reporter for The Hill. You can find her stories at thehill.com, and on Twitter it's at Emily Brooks News. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On Wall Street today, the Dow up 86, NASDAQ up 158, S&P up 32. Inflation in the United States is at its lowest point in over 2 years. The Labor Department says the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, for June was 3% versus a year earlier. That's down from 4% in May, but still over the Federal Reserve's 2% target rate. Associated Press writes that the 3% is a sign the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes have steadily slowed price increases across the economy. The White House National Economic Council Director Lael Brainerd talked today at the Economic Club of New York about inflation and the economy.
American workers have defied predictions that many would not return to the labor force following the pandemic. Recent months have seen the labor force participation rate by prime age workers rise above pre-pandemic levels, and even the participation rate for the overall workforce is now above its pre-pandemic trend. This has occurred as vacancies and payrolls have moderated. The economy is defying predictions that inflation wouldn't fall absent significant job destruction. Just today, we saw new and encouraging evidence that the economy is on the path to moderate inflation accompanied by a resilient jobs market. Annual CPI inflation is 3%, which is very close to the 2.9% average level that prevailed in the nearly 2 decades leading up to the financial crisis. Inflation is now the lowest among G7 nations in the U.S. for both headline and core, even as the recovery has been the strongest.
Lael Brainerd is director of the White House National Economic Council, speaking today at the Economic Club of New York. A statement from President Biden following the CPI report of 3% year over year in June. Begins good jobs and lower costs. That's Bidenomics in action. Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa, tweeting today, Bidenomics has cost working families thousands more per year, kept inflation higher than wage growth, and forced millions to take on record credit card debt. Americans aren't buying Biden's financial fantasy. And she attached this short video.
Runaway inflation.
That's Bidenomics.
Sky-high gas prices.
That's Bidenomics.
Unaffordable grocery prices.
That's Bidenomics.
Crushing the middle class.
It's Bidenomics in action.
That video posted by Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa. Tonight is the 15th annual Congressional Women's Softball Game for charity. Bipartisan team of House members and senators against a team of members of the media. 7 p.m. Eastern, it's being held at the Watkins Recreation Center on Capitol Hill. It'll be on C-SPAN 2 television. You can also watch on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or streamed at cspan.org. One of the players for the journalist team, Amy Walter, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, was interviewed this week by NBC reporter Kristen Welker.
Before I let you go, I have to ask you about a big event here in Washington on Wednesday night, the Congressional Women's Softball Game. You're going to be playing in it. Tell us about it, Amy.
That's right. This is the 15th year. Here we are, 15th annual women members of the media up against a bipartisan group of women members of Congress. It is the only such event where there's a bipartisan coalition of members. It's on Wednesday night. If you're in Washington, D.C., come on down. Tickets are $10. All of it goes to support the Young Survival Coalition, which is a nonprofit dedicated to younger women with breast cancer. There's breast cancer awareness that is a major focus of this game. And over the years, over these 15 years, we've raised over $3 million for helping younger women who've had breast cancer and ensuring that young women do get tested.
A critical cause and such a fun night.
It's such a fun night.
Amy.
Thank you.
Good
Of course,
luck.
you're cheering for the media.
Of course, we're cheering for the media. Of course. We look forward to it. Thank you.
Reporters Amy Walter and Kristen Welker. Amy Walter will be previewing tonight's Congressional Women's Softball Game, 7 p.m. Eastern. It'll be on C-SPAN 2 television, again on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or streamed at cspan.org. Team Congress versus the Bad News Babes. That's the name of the D.C.-based journalist team. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.